All right, well, then I'm going to start right away, and I'm going to start us off with a quote, just letting myself know how long this is going to take. All right, so opium addiction. Opium addiction is a disease, a well-marked functional neurosis, and deserving recognition as such to a greater degree than it has hitherto received. In the vast majority of cases, the vice theory of its origin is incorrect, so that, with a few exceptions, the term opium habit is a misnomer, implying, as it wrongly does, that opiate using is under individual control. Now, this was how Dr. Jensen Mattison, one of the pioneers in the treatment of narcotic addiction in the United States, described what he called opium inebriety, or the opium disease, putting forward the rather bold hypothesis at the time that habitual consumption of narcotic substances was not necessarily a vice or even the manifestation of some innate disposition to deviance, but a psychological and physiological pathology which called for treatment rather than reproof. Now, while opioid addiction is generally regarded as a chronic relapsing neurological disease today, the road to that diagnosis has been a long and winding one. The early shift towards medicalization in our approach of substance abuse, and especially in our management of opiate and opioid addiction, has been the focus of my research. So while the history of addiction treatment in America has been a specific area of interest of several recent studies, much remains to uncover on the matter. Now, medicalizing addiction did not merely imply treating it with medication. It meant reframing the issue as a health concern within the scientific landscape of the time, so that it became first and foremost a subject for medical study and preoccupation, but also so that it became the sole jurisdiction of the medical profession. So the end of the 19th century, it's important to bear that in mind, it saw the rise of both organized medicine and medical specialism or specialization, particularly in large urban centers where habitual narcotic users were numerous. So in that context, a new disease meant a new untapped market with thousands of potential paying patients. Most of whom at the time were white, upper or middle class men and women. So medicalization, in other words, was not simply a social necessity or the fruit of spontaneous scientific advances, but it was also a professional strategy on the part of certain branches of American health professions. So my work, which drew mainly on medical sources, consisted, among other things, on shedding light on those strategies, be them scientific, therapeutic, or economic, that molded the foundations of what was then called inebriety specialists, but would come to be known in the 20th century as addictology. Now, today I wanted to discuss more specifically what I called pathologization tactics, which mainly include the production of a medical discourse and the elaboration of therapies devised by a then nascent medical profession to fight what came to be known as the leprosy of modern days. So while opium use was not quite novel in the United States in the mid-19th century, it was hardly identified as a problematic subject before the Civil War and the appearance of what historians called the army disease. So that was the first generation of opium addicts, many of whom were veterans and who had contracted their drug habit as a result of prolonged exposure to medicinal morphine on the battlefield. Now, over the last 3 decades of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, opiate addiction, and by that I mean the sustained and compulsive need for narcotics, both physical and psychological, and despite adverse consequences. So opiate addiction became an object of concern. Now, throughout the years, it would undergo a long and complex transformation in the eye of the American public, from personal vice to dangerous disease. That being said, reframing the drug habit as a pathology meant, first and foremost, creating a form of consensus over the fact that what was then labeled inebriety was indeed a disease. And that meant building a body of scientific evidence, studies, experimentation that was both vast and influential enough that it could in and of itself be regarded as a legitimate medical discourse, even if it wasn't necessarily universally accepted. Diagnosis, and the term must be understood not only as the individual act of the practitioner, but also and above all as a collective professional act, which consisted in mapping a new object in order to establish its specific nature and subsequently devise the most appropriate means to act upon it. And that implied being able to identify the problem and its different manifestations or symptoms in patients. Also, it implied determining the etiology of the disease, that is to say, the potential causes of that illness. And finally, establishing that both those causes and manifestations justifiably fell into medical jurisdiction. And that was not an easy feat, because pathologizing the drug habit in 19th century America went against both commonly held perceptions of opiate users on the one hand, and against the interest of many powerful groups on the other, including part of the medical profession itself. When opiate addiction was first truly identified in America, so shortly after the Civil War, most observers saw habitual narcotic consumption, and especially opium consumption, as a minor vice, then increasingly as some sort of unhealthy way of life that threatened both the physical and moral integrity of habitués, that's what opium users were called, and more ominously, that threatened the fundamental values of the American society. And the first to get blamed for spreading the habit were Chinese immigrants through their opium joints, as you can see here. Now the joints, or the dens, as they were called, began to multiply in the US in the 1870s, especially in New York and San Francisco. And they sort of led to the first categorization of regular narcotic use, not merely as a personal depravity, but as a dangerous lifestyle, and one that, on top of everything else, was foreign in origin. So it was an evil that pertained not only to people, to individuals, but to greater cohesive collectivity, and that could therefore endanger society at large. Now, a reporter investigating recreational opium smoking in the late 90s called it, quite tellingly, a vice of the vilest kind, an imported vice. That being said, this early discourse on the origin of opium addiction, which framed the Chinese community as the main responsible for the problem, was largely mistaken, and probably purposefully mistaken. While opium dens did contribute to popularizing narcotic use, especially in large metropolises, opium smoking was really a minor cause in the rise of addiction. And as a minority of physicians in the 1870s and 80s, and attempted to point out, and that actually an overwhelming majority of historians now acknowledge, opiate addiction in the late 19th century was generally iatrogenic in origin, which means that it was an affliction contracted accidentally and in the course of medical treatment, very much actually like the current opioid epidemic. The first wave of narcotic addiction that hit the United States was largely triggered by the quasi-unregulated use of featured among the most popular drugs freely available in pharmacies and enthusiastically prescribed by physicians. And in a world where heroic medicine, where the choices basically lay between traditional herbal medicine or violent treatments, including bloodletting or purgatives or ingesting poisonous substances, a world where antibiotics or vaccine and antipyretics did not exist, we have to keep in mind that painkillers were regarded as the ultimate panacea. And as such, opiates were prescribed for almost any possible ailment, from fever to female troubles, anesthesia, stomach cramps, and even, and this is true, to cure alcoholism. Now, this meant that very few people, be them general practitioners, pharmacists, or even suffering patients, wanted to hear that prolonged or regular consumption of opiates for medical reasons could and frequently would lead patients down the path of addiction, regardless of their inclination or personality. In addition, American physicians own accountability in accidentally spreading chemical dependence through the indiscriminate and often ill-advised administration of morphine was quite certainly a factor in these practitioners' long-standing disinterest or even blunt denial of the pathological nature of narcotic addiction. However, as cases multiplied between the 1870s and the 1890s, as the consumption of opium per capita skyrocketed, it was actually, it increased threefold between the 70s and the 90s. A small number of physicians became interested in what they termed the disease of inebriety. And it was, according to them, a pathological compulsion to consume intoxicants and the subsequent inability to function normally without them. And indeed, addiction to opiates was identified, especially among middle-aged and middle-class women in rural areas. They were frequently prescribed morphine, and a little less frequently cocaine a little bit later, for a wide range of female troubles. And these respectable patients hardly fit the profile of the loose women who frequented the dens and who were often described as prostitutes or actresses, although actually little evidence of that subsists in reliable sources. Or they didn't fit the idea that people had of the lascivious, carefree urban opium smoker either. So consequently, many physicians started to wonder if maybe opium inebriety could be a pathology rather than a moral failing, only pursued by those they viewed as pleasure seekers. And these doctors, who were usually neurologists, saw an opportunity of both a scientific and professional nature. Because if inebriety, or narcomania, as it would be known in the 90s, was indeed a disease, then there was room for the creation of a new medical specialty entirely devoted to treating it. Now, the risks of morphine poisoning, or morphinism, or morphinomania, so in essence, the development of a chemical dependence to morphine that pushed its victims to consume the narcotic on a regular basis, and often in increasing quantities, had been regularly pointed out by medical professionals, both in the United States and in Europe, since at least the 60s. But at the same time, medical literature on the subject was still very scarce, and the assumptions of the people who were interested in it were mostly, or actually entirely empirical, because the 19th century medical sciences could present little hard evidence of the lasting neurological effects that opiates had on regular users. And thus, for many years, little mind was paid to those quirky inebriety specialists who were often dismissed as quacks. And in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, things began to shift, slowly but surely. One of the reasons was that individual life and the way it was affected first by the increasingly collective and demanding organization of a rapidly industrializing society, and in turn, the way individual life impacted that society. That became an ever-growing source of concern for pretty much everyone, but especially for medical men. And concurrently, new discoveries on the biology of the human body were made, and new scientific theories emerged, and they offered much more convincing frames for the disease theory of inebriety, as it was called. And as such, a legitimate scientific discourse could emerge and enable a new form of diagnosis. The industrial and scientific revolutions unfolded throughout the Reconstruction period and the Gilded Age held an era of innovations and progress. First, railroads and cars and planes were introduced to the public, telephones and telegraphs proliferated, urban centers boomed, etc. So intellectual, social, sensory stimulations were at a peak. But while modern society was full of new opportunities and marvels, the ensuing agitation was also deemed extremely taxing for American citizens, at least according to a newly minted medical specialty called neurology. And ultimately, all that stress contributed, in their eyes, to American people's penchant for narcotics. So in 1890, a recovering addict blamed industrialization and capitalism for the increase of drug use in America. And he said, as you can see, our mechanical invention, the spread of our commerce, our mad race, the speedy wealth, which entails feverish excitement, all this is a growth so rapid and in some respects so abnormal that in many directions the mental strain has been too much for the physical system to bear. There has been far too little time given to eating properly, to sleep, to recreation, and to healthful amusement. Till finally, the overworked body and the overtaxed brain needs find rest in the repeated use of opium or morphine. Now, in that context, it wasn't surprising that inebriety from either alcohol or opium was commonly associated with another condition called neurasthenia. It was another new and rather fashionable diagnosis. Neurasthenia, also known as nervous exhaustion, according to its creator, Dr. George Beard, was the pathological manifestation of general nerve sensitiveness, one that could be inherited, but also developed as a result of an exhausting lifestyle. And the genesis of the disease could be traced to a total depletion of nervous energy in the nervous system, basically. And it could be caused by either physical or psychological factors. And then when the energy was depleted, the patient would suffer a nervous breakdown and remain in that state until it was somehow replenished, lest the condition devolved into more serious problems, such as inebriety or even epilepsy or insanity. Now, the heightened sensitivity of the neurasthenic patients made for, as Beard said, an increased susceptibility for stimulants and narcotics. And as such, inebriety in itself was thought to be a part of the nervous diathesis, or constitutional predisposition to nervousness. So basically, it was seen as a symptom or a particular manifestation of nervousness, that disease that plagued so many modern Americans. And another doctor, Leslie Keeley, an early addictologist and well-known entrepreneur, went so far as dubbing opiate addiction the secret leprosy of modernity. Additionally, American specialists, the first inebriety specialist, who had organized themselves into a national society, the American Association for the Cure of Inebriety, or AACI, putting forth the idea that the propension to use opiates and develop narcomania was almost certainly hereditary. Which meant that habitués could not be held responsible for their behavior, since their compulsion was not a choice, but a genetic disorder. It also meant that narcomania could be classified as a neurological disease, along such diverse ailments as hysteria or insomnia or anxiety, migraines, or even epilepsy. And it meant, finally, that medical care should ideally be provided for these patients. Now, although there was at the time no real consensus over the exact nature or the status of narcotic addiction at the turn of the century, the disease theory progressively gained in popularity between 1890 and 1915, more or less. And if addicted people were indeed compelled to take opiates by genetics or by nervousness rather than choice, if their habit was neither an indulgence nor a vice, but a bona fide disease, there lied a true revolution in the social perception of these opiate users, but also an unprecedented opportunity for the budding medical profession in the United States. And soon, inebriety specialists, they would not call themselves addictologists before the middle of the 20th century, started to appear with a wide array of treatments that would very soon save the unfortunate victims of morphine, opium, and cocaine and restore them to health, or so they claimed. Not all physicians, of course, sought to instrumentalize the suffering of compulsive narcotic consumers for professional gain. Many actually genuinely believed that they could put an end to them. But in any case, patientizing drug users to turn them into paying customers was an essential first step. And in order to do that, the users themselves needed to be convinced that they were sick and that they needed medical attention. And two main strategies were used. First, a medical discourse spread through scientific popularization, pamphlets, posters, the daily press, and especially much lobbying on the part of specialists to general practitioners, because family doctors were key to reaching patients. And that discourse highlighted the physiological and psychological dangers of addiction. And secondly, the other strategy was relentless advertising campaigns that often promoted magic cures, so that addicts basically would be informed all at once that they were sick and they could be cured. Because if you convince people that they are diseased, but you offer no solution, it's not particularly interesting for them. Now, memory loss, listlessness, disturbed digestion, constipation, dizzy spells, suicidal thoughts, nausea, narcosis were among the symptoms that were most often listed in those early texts as side effects. And they were among the reasons why patients eventually sought to get rid of their drug problem. But at the same time, shame and the apprehension of pain associated with withdrawal meant that cures had to be particularly attractive. So marketability became a key element for many aspiring addictologists. So a cohort of professionals and amateur quacks soon began to develop nostrums or specifics, so basically secret formulas, hoping to suppress addicts' craving and to relieve their physical pain and rejuvenate their nervous system, frequently with no supervision at all. And these home cures, as they were called, had a lasting appeal, especially to those who had limited means and who could not afford lengthy treatments. Now, in that context, it was not surprising either that seemingly magical and discreet cure for that secret leprosy of modern times started to multiply in the 80s as the disease theory of inebriety was gaining momentum. And the main appeal was perhaps the comparative availability. Although they were not always cheap, they were still cheaper than sanitarium cures that I evoke in a few minutes. And they could be easily procured at the pharmacy or even ordered through the mail. And that seemingly non-intrusive aspect of treatment that could be taken in the secrecy of one's home was particularly attractive as well. Now, those miracle cures generally came in the form of large boxes filled with small vials to be taken over several days or several weeks, each dose dutifully numbered to convey the impression of a progressive treatment, while in actuality, tests conducted on a series of elixirs revealed that every bottle contained exactly the same thing. So marketing strategies were quite cleverly devised. In the absence of true labeling laws, the manufacturers could write pretty much anything they wanted on their bottles, that it contained exotic or precious ingredients, for example, such as gold, as you can see here. It was a particularly popular element, although gold has no property to treat addiction at all and is actually kind of dangerous for one's health. Also, it was said to contain silk or rare plants that suggested that they were extremely sophisticated preparations, and that must have meant they were good. These antidotes are usually vowed to cure the users with little discomfort and great efficacy, putting forth a rather outrageous claim and fanciful statistics such as a 90% success rate and a painless recovery. And the first home remedies often emanated from who actually did not claim to be physicians, but rather recovering addicts themselves, inducing some sort of sense of solidarity among struggling and misunderstood morphinists. And in the 1890s, things began to change a little bit because scientific medicine solidified and grew in popularity. And it became particularly interesting to convey an impression of medical authority, which usually resulted in the massive use of the words doctor and laboratory and professor on labels and adverts, such as Dr. Mika's cure, Professor Waterman's antidote, Dr. Mackman's elixir, etc., etc. And many of these entrepreneurs behind those remedies were still absolutely not doctors, but they could pretend that they were on the label. And that was probably the most dangerous side of these miracle home cures, not just the blatant fabrications and the dishonest claims made by the patent holders, but their actual composition, as they had not been made by scientists. And as early as 1877, a few physicians had tried to warn their peers about the high opiate content of many nostrums, including those that were supposedly designed to cure opiate dependence. And again, all things considered, it was rather unsurprising, because the easiest way to achieve a painless and thus much appreciated withdrawal is to not actually withdraw the drug, but substitute it. And so users were understandably quite impressed with the efficiency of the antidotes when they found that their cravings were indeed under control, and they were at the same time unaware that they were still consuming opiates. So it was, as one prominent specialist put it, merely addiction under a new name, and one that was directly profitable for dishonest pharmaceutical manufacturers. All in all, it wasn't before 1905 that the hunt for charlatans truly began, as progressivism led to a long but vigorous crusade against numerous patented drugs, which came to fruition with the anti-nostrums provision of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Now, quack remedies laced with opiates weren't quite the only available options. Some actual physicians, people who truly studied medicine and who truly knew something about addiction, also attempted to devise more serious cures. But unlike those home cures, these were frequently unpleasant to go through. Now, specialists had discovered quite early on that the apprehension of what would be known later as withdrawal symptoms played a major part in people's unwillingness to discontinue their habit. And the management actually of that painful period is still one of the main challenges of detoxification programs today, although it is also today inseparable from long-term continuum of care, since addiction is considered as a chronic disease. And in the 19th and early 20th century, it was often regarded as the most crucial stage of treatment, to the point that detoxification and recovery were sometimes thought to be one and the same. So when people were clean, when they were physically drug-free, they were considered cured. And as such, much of the early efforts to cure opiate addiction were focused on discontinuing the drug abruptly or gradually, then alleviating withdrawal pains, whilst cleansing the body of all trace of opiates. And at the same time, disregarded the long-term neurological and psychological repercussions of the illness that would so often cause people to relapse. Still, again, serious and more seasoned inebriety specialists usually scorn substitution medicine, and they prefer to go for the kill. And they prided themselves in divulging the formulas that they used to detoxify their patients, equating secret nostrums with quackery, which means that the list of ingredients were made public, either on the product or in the medical press. They were published in the medical press, as it was the case for the Townes Lambert cure that you see here. Now, these withdrawal cocktails were usually dreaded by patients because they often interpreted the idea of purging the body quite literally, and they contained potent ingredients thought to induce catharsis. So first, sedatives to compensate for the opiate withdrawal, such as codeine or atropine, for example. Then emetics and purgatives, for example, emetic tartar to make people vomit. And those were excruciating for the usually already exhausted body of the morphinomaniacs, but they were prized for their cleansing effects. And finally, many recipes included tonics or stimulants, which were loaded for their invigorating properties. But they also resulted in dangerous combinations of inhalers, 3 potentially deadly plants that had, on occasion, murdered patients. Now, those remedies, and it was the caveat, always had to be taken under the supervision of a medical professional, ideally in a private institution, which was considerably more costly than home cures and antidotes. And then the specialist would monitor the habitué's reaction and change his formula accordingly. But some specialists, especially those who had begun their careers as neurologists or more rarely as psychiatrists, believed that merely detoxifying the body was insufficient, and withdrawal needed to be followed by a long period of restoration, nerve restoration, and ideally personal psychological rehabilitation, which should be performed in a sanitarium. Much like today, treatment options available to well-off patients were quite different from those who were destined to lower-class citizens. While many had to contend with unscrupulous peddlers and dangerous nostrums, others could afford more pleasant and perhaps more effective stays in specialized institutions. A dichotomy that is actually quite painfully reminiscent of the current 2-tier treatment of people struggling with opiate addiction. So state-sponsored methadone clinics on the one for the underprivileged, mostly non-white users, and access to less invasive buprenorphine treatment and private rehab centers for wealthier, or at the very least, better insured Americans. And in the late 19th century, this stark contrast in treatment philosophies was already starting to emerge. While withdrawing the drug using a formula was almost universally accepted as the first step in treating habitués, inebriety specialists also, especially those who were enrolled in the renowned AACI, so American Association for the Cure of Inebriates, they believed in a more holistic approach. They believed that to truly cure addiction, you had to rehabilitate both the body and the mind. And this rehabilitation process and the word started to appear in the late 19th century in medical literature in connection to both narcotic and alcoholism treatment strategy. This rehabilitation was better implemented in remote, medicalized, but welcoming, wholesome institutions that were part hospitals and part retreats. And the best place to go was the newly popular sanitarium. Now, modern rehabs, and that's a term that is widely used today to refer to addiction treatment programs that involve a residential setting with long-term therapy and a mix of psychiatric and physical care. Those rehabs, they were very much modeled after these early sanitaria for nervous disease. And these were first and foremost remote, peaceful retreats where the stress of urban life could not corrupt recovering patients. Restoring the body after the ordeal of withdrawal, and in order to strengthen the nervous system again, cures, and even in the first correctional hospital treatments, so in prisons, the importance of sleep and plentiful, healthy food was always stressed. In institutions for recovering addicts, a 3 meals a day routine, mostly fresh fruit, vegetables, eggs, dairies, clean water was advertised, and not only as a comforting feature of the institution, but as an actual part of the cure itself. It was thought that too little food contributed to the reduction of nerve vitality, and too much meat, on the other hand, or bread and spirits would increase the production of harmful toxins and slow down the detoxification process. Habitual opiate users also needed, and that was very important, to recharge the nervous system in more assertive ways. And in times where the boundaries between science, superstition, and traditional medicine were still a little bit blurry, this metaphorical injunction of recharging the body was interpreted again quite literally in most sanitaria. And electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, and phototherapy were the most common physiological treatments that were used to restore patients to health. And unfortunately, I don't have much time to go into the specifics here, but here are two very interesting machines that were frequently used in these institutions. Basically, it was believed that water, light, and electricity could both purify and regenerate corrupted cells. But all in all, a healthier and cleaner lifestyle in the long run was necessary for recovery, and it could not be limited to changes made to the patient's physical form. Again, the leprosy of modern day was an ailment of the mind as much as a disease of the nervous system, and the addicted person's spirit had to be healed as well, lest they fell back into bad habits once they were released from the hospital. So this mental aspect of the cure was also important, and it was heavily inspired by French alienist Philippe Pinel's moral treatment, which had already been emulated in many American lunatic asylums at the end of the century. And indeed, mental reconstruction has been thought to play an important role in the in continued sobriety. Sustained contact with nature, for example, especially horses that have some magical power to help people get cured of addiction, apparently. Regularity and routine, all of that was key to strengthen the will and reassert the power of mind over flesh. A daily rhythm and rituals would help recovering addicts to return to a healthier lifestyle, and it would in the long term, facilitate their reintegration into an active life once they were out of the institution. Now, sanitaria typically had libraries, billiard rooms, chapels, and even music and drawing rooms. Silent, creative, and intellectual, but never stressful activities were thought to present the ability to quiet the mind and to soothe the inflammation of the nerves and brain. And while actual art therapy would not really become a staple of recovery programs in the US until the 1960s, cultivating patients' artistic and literary inclinations was seen as extremely beneficial. And by the late 1910s, when more advanced mental therapy and psychoanalysis begin to make their way into the last institution, they were actively linked to the practice of the arts. Singing, painting, drawing, and other crafts were regarded as ways to both address and sublimate addicts' abnormal libido. And in 1990, a special committee on the matter wrote that the reclamation of the addict will depend on the power he will have under guidance to direct this libido into higher thought and emotional levels. The pain of the world can be expressed in music, the longing of the world in marble, in painting, and in other creative forms. And only then, when the addict was deemed to be once again sound of mind and body, could he be discharged and, at long last, reintegrated. Now, to conclude at last, in 1877, as the first volume of the AACI's journal was published, one of its founding fathers was looking quite hopefully at the future, a future where addiction had been eradicated by a triumphant medical profession. And he said, "We may be but one of the forces at work in this cause, but we are far from being an unimportant one. The seed we sow is springing up and must in due time bear an abundant harvest. May we go on with our appropriate work with renewed diligence, confidence, and hope." Now, despite this enthusiasm, turn of the century miracle cures and sanitaria both failed to truly solve the problem of addiction. In fact, most of the 20th century would turn out to be a dark period for people suffering from drug problems. And it would be one of re-stigmatization of addicts, and it would also see a stark increase in therapeutic frustration. The vast majority of American treatment facilities specializing in addiction recovery disappeared in the 1910s, and they would not re-emerge until the 60s. First, the Harrison Act of 1914 made both selling and using opiates, even in the course of medical treatment, extremely hard. Then the Volstead Act in 1990 established the prohibition of alcoholic beverages, and it marked a decisive shift in the criminalization of narcotic substances consumption. And concurrently, as the risks of opiate habituation became more widely recognized and accepted within the medical community, at the same time more heavily regulated, it meant that iatrogenic addiction in upper and middle class patients declined, making way for younger, poor users, increasingly frequently associated with the criminal underworld. And additionally, new diagnoses surrounding the narcomaniac diathesis, especially that of hereditary psychopathy, which became fashionable in the 1920s, made these patients less and less attractive to physicians. They had fewer means, they were frequently reluctant, and they didn't want to get treated. And since the prevailing theory was that addiction was caused by a genetic mental disability, their prognosis was poor. So the disease theory did not so much disappear, but specialists' enthusiasm for finding a cure considerably wavered and waned in the face of this undesirable clientele. Late 19th century and early 20th century experimentation in treating addicted bodies and mind, however, was not entirely set aside and wiped away. Since the re-emergence of medical care for addicted people in the 1960s, it has become quite clear that it left a long-lasting mark in our current management of drug dependence. And as I mentioned, contemporary forms of treatment, such as rehabs, owe much to these inebriate sanitaria at the turn of the century in both treatment, philosophy, and actual therapy. And the legacy of the first addictologists is not entirely negative. Throughout the 20th century, they inspired many therapeutic efforts to improve the lives of people struggling with addiction. And addiction medicine and addiction programs, including harm reduction plans, have flourished in the last 4 decades, despite repeated drawbacks, generally hostile political climate, and the dangerous growth of a deregulated pharmaceutical industry, which, as we know, ushered in a new opiate epidemics in the last few decades. And to conclude, in the words of addictologist George Vaillant, if you want to treat an illness that has no easy cure, first of all, treat it with hope.